Good evening, wanderers. Thank you for joining me on this late night stroll together. Tonight's tale is NosfetatuNacht and deals with one of the most ancient and horrifying creatures known to man, the Stigori. But do not fear that which moves in the dark, for you are safe here. So, let us begin. For just over 15 years, Berkshire, England, in its bright and wondrous splendor, was the breeding ground for joy and cheer. Every year, the denizens of the city would gather around the center of the square to share tales of the otherworldly, tales of goblins, elves, witches, and wizards, tales of heroism and valor. This particular holiday was known to them as Lore Night, the one time of year where any patron, young and old, were invited to come in any countries or cultures in the world. Lore Night always began upon the setting sun, and would seldom end until the rising dawn. Of course, food, and the best of the freshly brewed ale, were always anticipated on this night. Fresh killed and adequately prepared game, accompanied by what would be compared to, at least, 2 full-grown fields of delicious crops. On select few occasions, it was said that there would even be music played, as the tales larger than life were being told. The best aspects of Lore Night, according to most in Berkshire, was when one storyteller would subtly attempt to weave their tale in such a way that it would attempt to outdo the other tales being told that night. For example, 2 years back, a young man captivated all in attendance, beyond all others, with his tale of a fierce and virtuous warrior that would conquer beasts and dragons alike for the protection of his kingdom. Another tale that was applauded above all others, one particular Lore Night, was spoken by a Norwegian sailor who regaled his own account of encountering and protecting his vessel against the wrath of the damnable Dragor. Until tonight, this tale was considered incontestable in its popularity among the commoners of Berkshire. This Lore Night, however, would shift the history of Berkshire, forming an irrevocable crimson stain on its otherwise joyous visage. This year's Lore Night began like every year before it. The excited and anxious storytellers began to amass in the center of the city, where at least 3 cords of dry logs lay, neatly prepared for the token bonfire that would blaze for the night's festivities. Long tables of food and drink began being prepared. The market clerk who always ran the meat and produce stand was, as always, had been from the prior years on this night, at the forefront for preparing this holiday feast. On this occasion, however, he was prepared to make this Lore Night feast bigger and more gluttonous than any ever before, and any to come. The timbermen of Berkshire began to double the size of the festive pyre, as an insurance of its continuous burning. It seemed that the commoners intended for this year's Lore Night to be the biggest and boldest of them all, as if it may be their last, and for many of them, this night would indeed be their very last. The setting sun saw the lighting of the festive pyre in the center of town. Many gasped and awed at the monumental height of the hungry, scorching flames, easily tripling the height and overall size of years before. At this, the mass hastily flocked to the table, adorned with the gratuitous feast. Indeed, the market clerk and those in his assistants had outdone themselves. For even upon the setting sun's last glimmer, many were still preoccupied with gorging themselves on the delectable meal and were unable to tell their tales they had prepared all year for this night. That is, except for one man. This man, in fact, declined silently to partake in the feast. No one saw him touch so much as a single crumb from the bountiful buffet. 1 or 2 individuals approached him, attempting to extend warm invitations to join in the bountiful banquet. The stranger answered these advances with a cold, stoic, and malignant stare. Upon witnessing this behavior from the stranger, many in the congregated mass began to feel the slight chill crawl up their spine as they observed the stranger linger by the festive bonfire, whose heat had begun to grow so immense as to be felt by all in the nearby vicinity. Even as the heat of the blaze intensified, however, The stranger wouldn't remove the long, dark, ashen-gray trench coat, whose collar was erected upwards, as to conceal his face, only exposing the eyes under the brim of his pitch-black, wide-rimmed hat. As he stood so close to the pyre, that the congregation began to wonder what kept him from being able to be set ablaze himself. The features of the strangers, or lack thereof, became more pronounced. The muted stranger's eyes were covered in red, raging veins, giving them an appearance not wholly dissimilar to a rabid animal. The irises were as devoid of hue as the trench coat that concealed his features from view. In the center, however, the stranger's pupils were somehow even darker than the night sky above, itself as if looking into them could cause one to be stripped of their soul in mere seconds. In spite of the stranger's foreboding presence, the attending mass gathered around the towering inferno that was the festive pyre, as it was time for the night's tales to be told. However, despite the full year's time spent preparing for this very moment, none in attendance could remember what stories they came to tell. None, that is, except for the stranger.
"So you've gathered here for stories, have you?"
uttered a cracked and hoarse voice, as if the speech was performed under some intense strain on the vocal cords. Though hoarse and strained the words were, every individual ear had perceived them. There was a clear stance of certainty in everyone's minds that the voice was indeed that of the stranger, who, until that very moment, remained distantly cold and completely mute. The sudden shift in the stranger's behavior caused the attending mass to take aback and shock.
"I will share a story with you all. A story that will make you realize the mistake you've all made, and have made for a generation now."
At this statement, a dreadful chill overtook the wind's breeze, causing the patrons to shiver, despite the ever-blazing inferno before them. The abrupt change in temperature caused some to position themselves closer to the flames, in a feeble attempt to find some semblance of warmth, in the midst of the suddenly chilly air, in an attempt that proved futile, as if the very essence of the flame's natural heat had been taken away, leaving them to dance wildly about atop the festive pyre. This abrupt phenomenon, coupled with the formerly mute stranger's threatening and rather ominous statement, forced an air of unease and a jarring sense of dread to spread throughout the congregation.
"None of you believe in the entities in whose name you forged these tales of fiction from, effectively desecrating the respect and fear that they were once due."
None of the patrons in the present mass knew how to comprehend the mystery stranger's abusive claims. Surely, they optimistically thought, the facade is nothing but a mere tactic for captivating the audience's attention. This was Lore Night, a night of fun and cheer, in the regaling of folk legends from elder days, and tall tales molded in the machinations of an eager imagination, not the grim and macabre as implied by the stranger.
"The tale I tell you now is from my land from which I hail. Take special care to listen, for when penance comes upon you all, you then may know in your beating hearts and your tortured souls the full extent of those who you in your mockeries have disgraced. This tale,"
the stranger began, remaining stiff as if he were a statue cut from marble or granite, with his unwavering menacing glare eternally fixed within the festive pyre's flames,
"begins with the priest of my native land, Father Dirkenshaw. You see, the father was a good man, a righteous man. Holy as he was, the wills and righteous ways of God Most High blinded the father into the ways of arrogance, to closing his mind to the powers beyond the grasp of even the Heavenly Father's might to contest."
As the stranger continued his blasphemous, macabre narrative, a stench of decay and formaldehyde laced the air that was breathed by the congregated audience, forcing more than many of them to begin to gag, whilst others attempted the banquet they enjoyed profusely from being emptied from their stomachs, as the offensive order continued to pollute the formerly fresh air.
Father Dirkenshaw had no tolerance for any such aspect of life that was not deemed of being from God's will. Much like all of you, Father Dirkenshaw was far too swift to brush away anything not deemed of holy merit, but mere illusions of the deluded and perverted minds. Like all of you, the Father conducted his life in this manner for many a generational cycle, blissfully ignorant of the forces that play beyond the sacred rites of Christian faith.
The flames began to shift in color, from bright orange to an infernal red. All at once, the formerly lost heat returned twofold, forcing the patrons to profusely sweat. Beyond the minor physical discomfort, however, was an infernal terror that this, as well as the previous phenomenon, must in some way or another be connected to the stranger. This collectively agreed on conclusion was not voiced by any, however, so as not to draw undesirable attention to themselves, as well as to feed their equally growing sense of morbid curiosity in hearing exactly where the stranger's story would go next. The stranger's eyes widened, further pronouncing their disturbing appearance.
That is,
he continued, his voice further distorting with each uttered word,
until the arrival of a conjurer, whose very nature could and did challenge the will of the Church. No one knows where he wandered from, as no one could remember any interaction with him. They hadn't even known his name.
The surrounding darkness outside the immediate radius of the bonfire's light began to crawl inward towards the towering blaze, engulfing nearly all the congregated patrons, leaving only a select few to be spared from the shadows by the ever-raging fire's light. Whimpers of terrified anxiety rose as they began to lose sight of each other in the encroaching void, whilst the stranger, still illuminated in the glow of the blaze, continued regaling them of his ghostly testament. The stranger finally began to undo the buttons of his trench coat, though not quite yet enough to expose his features, apart from his corpse-like eyes.
You see, the conjurer wanted to live in peace amongst the natives,
the stranger continued, his cold, sinister gaze appearing to make the flames dance more viciously upon the festive pyre than before.
But his hunger and his conflicting practices forced him into a life of cold solitude. He would spend days in blissful hibernation and walk the land under the moon's glow. That alone, while not trivial and mysterious to the commoners, was not what caused them to shun him. It was his unnatural palate for living blood.
It was at this very moment when the now captivated mass, what they could only describe as being chilling laughter of a pack of hyenas who lost themselves to some state of hysteria. Hearing those cackles, individuals found themselves grateful, in an odd sort of way, that the oppressive darkness that now had nearly swallowed each individual had rendered them unable to see so much as their hands in front of their faces, lest they be forced to envision whatever demonic beings could produce such a noise. Despite the increasingly overwhelming urge to attempt flight from this morbid phenomenon occurring in the city's center, none of the congregation could find within them the strength of will to even flee in fear. The stranger's ghoulish narrative continued, despite the infectiously spreading dread amongst the mass, who were now swallowed entirely by the looming shadows.
His taste, his lust for warm, fresh blood could never be sated, for such is the existence of one such as he, always craving, never enough. However, in spite of his ravenous nature, he wished only peace for the village folk. For many years, he would live off the blood of the livestock. One night, upon his awakening, the conjurer spied upon a beautiful maiden. the most beautiful of any in the long recorded history of his lifetime to ever have or ever would walk these lands. The love birthed within him has it not been felt since his conception into this earth.
The manic howls from deep within the looming shadows
Became louder, growing closer and more pronounced.
much in the same fashion as a group of predators encircling their helpless victims, allowing the venomous fear to cripple mind and body before engorging themselves on the fresh pound of flesh. Screams and shrieks of fright rang into the ever-persisting darkness as glints of maliciously ravenous eyes shone as crimson as that of rupees, encrusted within the trinkets of the maidens present in this horrific scene of unholy events. Having left with no conceivable alternative for escaping the menacing darkness and whatever malevolent evils within, the mass began to congregate as close to the blazing festival pyre as physically possible, yet still taking great care to space away from the stranger, as if wandering too close to his presence may see them afflicted by some nature of uninsanity, power that he may supposedly possess.
What be thy lordly given name, sir, from distant lands beyond? She asked the mysterious conjurer. To this the conjurer spoke the very name that reigns the utmost supremacy in the land that I hail. I, my sweet delicate blossom, am Lord Vladimir Calvishulus of the Eastern Kingdoms.
The stranger roared the name aloud, causing the blaze to flare in an angry burst, and the deranged howls and cackles within the consuming darkness to bark out into the open night, creeping ever closer to the center. As swiftly as his eyes could entrap hers,
her heart succumbed to his lustful whim. Many a night following, the proud Lord Calviculus would call her from her tower to meet him, purely for the consumption of her precious blood from her beautiful porcelain neck. It was said that Lord Calviculus's bite filled the maiden's heart with further desire for him.
For each night, it is said that she grew restless,
impatient for her consort's return.
At this, many within the congregation began to feel cold, petite hands softly caressing their bare flesh, while the cackles within the consuming void continued to advance on them. Soft, insane whispers were heard by each individual ear in the captive mass, almost appearing sensual in nature. The stranger, whose damning glare never arrested from the ceaseless fury of the furious flames within the festive pyre, continued while his voice further stripped away into a malicious rattle, pyre hatred as his tale went on.
Oh, her blood he did drink, drink and drink,
until she no longer answered her master's siren's call. For many a night he searched for her, starving of the young mistress's blood, when he discovered the truth of her absence.
For after they last met, the natives spoke against her to the ever-righteous Father Dirkenshaw,
who, in all of his holy practices, ruled her to the world of the Holy Father above, as a witch, a devil's familiar. With their faith unwavering and their blind convictions, the distraught lord found that his maiden had been felled.
Like many a maiden, fell victim to blind conviction by a raging fire like this before all of you now.
Screams of inhuman agony deafened the congregation as the wild and untamed flames began to shape and form themselves into a delicate young maiden. Just as soon as its fiery birth was complete, a blackened maw opened that released an agonized wail that invoked an unutterable pain and sorrow that blended with the presently potent fear within the mass that could not and would not waver. As the flames returned to their former state, unyielding in its enraged ferocity, the stranger began again, his ghastly vocals
taking on an air of aggression. Vengeance! Vengeance he swore to exact on those holy ways that led them to commit this atrocity. Upon them, in the cold night, he came. Many a morn the following, the families would find more of their dear beloved gone in the night, only to be spies upon the succeeding dusk. As one of the disciples of the Nosferatu, Lord Vladimir Claviculus, I condemn you all, you bleeding sheep of the Lord, he roared to them one full moon twilight. Damn you, damn all of you, whose faith blinds you to the wills that exist beyond God's law. Your actions deemed righteous by your God because of your lack of vision and lack of control, stripped me of what I held dear to me. For this, I declare that as long as I am bound to walk these lands with earthly feet, the setting sun on this night for every generation to come, myself and my dwellers of the night will come. Any of whom we spy in their play, we shall strip away from you, as you stripped her away from me. For this I swear to you and all whose faith and corrupted practice conducts their life. For this night will belong to us, the Nosferatu, the vampire. I christen this very gravely dusk, along with all those that reoccur on every century to come, as NosfetatuNacht, the vampire's night. And upon the declaration's conclusion, the vampire, Lord Claviculus, began his dark campaign, with sating his feral urge for blood. He spilled from the great priest, Father Dirkenschau. Many perished at the wrath and burning ire, for warm, innocent blood that night, before the sun rose, warding him away until the next annual cycle awakened him, concluding in the same grotesque manner as before. The abysmal calliope intensified to a deafening pitch, with only the stranger's ghoulishly raspy voice being able to be distinguished separately. From that night, and every Nosferatu night since, Lord Claviculus has walked on this cold night, sating his desire for blood on those that foolishly neglect to pay credence to his words. Upon conclusion of the stranger's horrifying anecdote, the mad cackles of malice abruptly died, shrouding the congregation in a jarring silence, save only for the crackling of the flames, as the stranger began to remove his trench coat and hat for the first time, revealing a gaunt and bony face, bound with gray and clammy flesh, pulled taut over his skull, and long wispy strands of albino hair. His cold, blue, dead lips began to pull upward into a deranged vulpine grin that exposed his unnaturally long, thin canine molars, sharp as the nobleman's dagger. At the sight of this, a young maiden from the terror-stricken audience squealed out, "Who are you?" The stranger, stealing his gaze away from the festive pyre for the first time, fixed his eyes on her. "My dear, delicate blossom, I am Lord Claviculus of the Eastern Kingdoms, and tonight is NosfetatuNacht, the vampire's night." At the chilling revelation, the blazing fire burst skyward, defiantly into the air, to illuminate the horde of beasts that took residence in the lurking darkness only moments before, each and every one of them baring their vicious fangs, for indeed they were the servants of the vampire. No sooner than the first squeal of hysteria was let out, that the stranger, Lord Claviculus, bared his own fangs, rolling his eyes back into his skull with pleasure, as he clamped his jaw around the young maiden's neck, savoring every last amount of crimson that he could take from her. As he rose from her, now stripped of life, the once furious flames abruptly ceased, shrouding the helpless mass in complete darkness, as the Nosferatu came upon them. Try as they might,
none of the commoners could escape. The inhuman and supernatural clutches of the scourging beasts as they were swept away and torn apart like a herd of lambs in the midst of a wolf's den, from what must have been in every direction in the impossible looming darkness. No cries of mercy were heard or heeded when the sun rose that morn. Silence had laid its claim to Berkshire. All that remained of the events of the accursed night were the smoldering embers of the festive pyre, and the mutilated, exonerated remains of the Lordite Mass, now set to be bound to the tradition of NosfetatuNacht. Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. Special shout out to Corpse Child, the author of this story. Keep up the excellent work. And if you enjoyed this story, please stick around for other works. I've got a special project coming to you guys, hopefully in about a week, and I look forward to seeing it. Thanks so much for listening. This project was a lot of work, probably the most I've ever put into one of these, but I really enjoyed it. I love a good vampire story, and I hope to see you all very soon. Until then, never wander alone.